state your name and the year you were born in.
Frank Charles Brooks, 1939. My mother and my father, they were down in Tampa, Florida at the time. My mother was originally from Pennsylvania and grew up around Pennsylvania, but they liked to, her and her parents liked to travel wintertime and that down to Florida and back, depending how they felt. And so she was in Florida there, and she ended up marrying my father. And then I was born in January 1939 at the Davis Island Hospital in Tampa, Florida.
What was it like growing up with that type of family?
Well, it's hard to say because my father ended up was down in Tampa, and my mother had moved back up to Pennsylvania, was with her parents there, and we were living in Malvern, Pennsylvania, or I believe in Malvern. And when she got a phone call there in February of 1947 saying that my father had died. He had drowned in the Hillsborough River down in Tampa under mysterious circumstances, I'll put it that way. They think he might have been killed by a young group of thugs or something like that, and then his body tossed into the river there. I would have been about 8 years old. About September time frame there in 1947, she enrolled me in a school in Philadelphia called Girard College.
Okay.
And it was a private school for quote unquote poor white male orphans.
Wow.
See, your father had to be dead, and so I actually spent almost 10 years at the school there. You could go home on vacations in summer and things like that, But the rest of the school year, you were wards of the city of Philadelphia who were overseeing the school. It still exists with a huge stone wall all the way around it. Keep us in and keep them out. Yes. Well, the difference because there was no girls around. You missed a lot, I guess you would say, the social life you would have with girls around and so forth. When you got in your senior year and junior years and that, they did have dances there. And of course they would have some girls in Philadelphia there, I guess, that they've had contact with, and they would line up and you'd end up with like a blind date. You'd go and pick her up and bring her to the dance and then take her home and things like that. But that was basically it. They lined up a job for me because you could work in your business career areas, schooling and that, or you can take up a trade, and I took up the trade of electrical.
That's
and
cool.
So when I graduated, they lined up an interview with the Philadelphia Electric Company, and so I had a job with Philadelphia Electric Company. I was sharing an apartment with a couple other friends that had graduated from the school. And one of the guys, a person I was working with, said, "You want to go to California?" I said, "Yeah." And he had a 46 Cadillac convertible with electric windows. I thought, amazing, electric windows. And so we drove that down to Miami, Florida, ran out of money, and I ended up joining the Navy. I told him I wanted to go to California for basic training. And they said, "Well, we'll see what we can do." And so got on a flight there, and the flight stopped in St. Louis and then on up to Great Lakes, and I decided I was not going to California. So I did all my naval training up at Great Lakes. I don't know, I kept thinking, well, I didn't want to join the Navy originally because I thought there's no pockets in those sailor suits they had. But then I didn't think, well, I don't know about the Marines. And for some reason, I just joined the Navy. So I ended up spending 5 years, 5 days in the Navy. My original enlistment was for 4 years. And I was, after I went to schooling, they trained me as an interior communications electrician, which means we took care of the telephones, the gyro compasses, the communications on the ship, and so forth. Got out of the training school along with a friend of mine who was in the same class as I was up there. And we reported into Norfolk, Virginia to go to our ship. And we were both assigned to the aircraft carrier, the USS Wasp, a World War II aircraft carrier. I got in there in the morning. He got in later in the afternoon. I reported to Chilton, which was a troop transport ship. And it went down and picked up a whole group of Marines and then headed across the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. And so I spent a couple of weeks going across the Atlantic, stopped in Gibraltar, and I got off with some others, spent the night on a Jeep aircraft carrier, they call it, and the next morning got on a plane and they flew us down to Naples. And that's where the Wasp had pulled into port. About a day or so later, we were all called back to the ship and we set sail down, went over to Beirut, Lebanon. The ship that I'd crossed over with the Marines actually landed those Marines in Lebanon, Beirut there. I guess we're having some conflicts over there, as usual. And so we were anchored off the shore there of the airport, and we sat there for a couple days and that sunbathing. Then this friend of mine who had been left back there in Norfolk, Virginia, they flew him all the way over there and landed him on the ship. Ended up spending 3 years total on the ship there. Also went down to Cuba, Guantanamo Bay there for trial runs and stuff. They had the Congo crisis there. I ended up had an assignment to go back up to Great Lakes for more schooling. So I was taken off the ship and flew up and to Great Lakes. Everybody on the ship crossed the equator and did the ceremony for crossing it, but I wasn't there. I was up there going to school. Then they came down and told me, "Oh, you got shore duty." So then I ended up having to report into Little Creek, Virginia, amphibious base. So I spent the year, and then just as I get ready to get out, the Cuban crisis occurred. And so they extended everybody, and so I was extended an extra 5 days. So I was in the Navy 5 years, 5 days. And to say that's the end of that story. So when I got out of the Navy down to Little Creek, then I went back up to Boston for a year. Then decided, I think I want to go back in the Navy. So I went over and saw the Navy recruiter. He says, "Okay, on this date you have to go into Boston there and get sworn in." And so I went in to Boston there. I said, "Well, we can't swear you in today because we haven't got your blood tests back from the hospital." I got mad, called up a recruiter and said, "Tear up the papers, heck with this." So I went back and continued working for the telephone company. There was a young fellow I was working with who said, "I want to go over and see the Air Force recruiter." And he says, "Would you go with me at lunchtime and then you can tell me if he's feeding me a line or what, you know?" I said, "Sure." So I went over with him and he talked to the recruiter, and the recruiter says, "Well, I'm afraid I can't tell you what we can put you in until you take some aptitude tests. And that way we know what you're qualified for." So I said to him, "What about prior service people?" He says, "Well, that depends on what career field you were in, how long you've been out, what rank you got out at and that." So I told him, I says, "This is the rank I got out, and this is how, and a little less than a year, and this is the career field I was in." So he opens up the book, he says, "Well, we can take you in straight across, keeping the same rank you had when you got out of the Navy. This looks like this is the career field you're qualified for." I said, "Where do I sign up?" So I ended up in the Air Force. The family I was living with were very devout Catholics, and I loved them dearly. Of course, I at the time was basically Protestant, we'll say. And one day, Bob Fannin came home from work, and he had with him a Mormon Tabernacle Choir record of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And I thought, "Wow, what's this?" You know, I never heard of them before. And then at the same time, they were getting ready to put on the New York World's Fair. The Mormons were going to build a replica of their temple in the World's Fair. As I said, I ended up joining the Air Force. I asked if I could be assigned, the recruiter, get an assignment overseas. They said no, they didn't have any openings overseas, but they had a couple stateside, and so I picked the one closest there, and that was just Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington, D.C. While I was down there, got a phone call from one of the guys that I used to work with. He says, hey, he says, Bob Rotz is coming out from Ohio, so you want to come on up and we can go to the New York World's Fair? I said, sure. Well, while touring the fair there, I saw the replica of the Mormon temple, but I saw some literature there in the Book of Mormon and that, so I just picked those up and that was it. When I got back to the base down at Andrews Air Force Base, there was one of the cards there said, would you like more information about the church? And I thought, yeah, that'd be interesting. So I put a check mark there. Would you like somebody to stop by and visit with you? I said no, so I left that blank. And I mailed it. So sometime later I got a phone call, and it was Elder Harding. And he says, we got a reference for you here. And I thought in my mind, I guess they can't read that there was I didn't check that block. I didn't want anybody contacting me. But I thought, well. So he says, can we set up an appointment for, say Friday something or Saturday night? I says, well, that wouldn't work for me. But we end up setting a date. Then they called me up later and says, we got to cancel that one because we have a baptism. So can we set up a new time frame? And we couldn't come up with an agreement. And so I said, no. Never heard from him again. A young fellow that was working for me. And he says, would you mind taking me out after work? He says, I want to buy a car. I need to get insurance for it and so forth. So I drove him out and he went in and he got insurance. In Maryland, you got your license plates only at the Capitol, but what you can do there is you can pay other people to go up and get the license plates for you. So he told me where to go. Well, he pulled over there. We went to this location, and I looked across the street, and the elders had told me that where we were to meet at before they canceled the meeting was at the Kimball's grocery store and gas station. And I looked across the street, and there was the Kimball's grocery store and gas station. I said to him, I says, well, while you're inside there taking care of this, I'm going to go across the street. So I went across the street there and went in, and Brother Kimball was in there along with his sons. I said I had been talking to the missionaries there. They were talking about setting up an appointment, but we could never get together there, and I haven't heard from them since. I said, so could you leave a message for him when you see him to get back with me? And he said, okay. The missionaries got back with me. I took the lessons in up at their house, which was up above the gas station. And later I found out that he went up and told his wife, and she says, I wonder if that's the guy that they waited down there a couple hours for, but he never showed up. But as I look back on that, I end up thinking, well, first off, why had they changed the rules to get back in the Navy? Could it be because I wasn't supposed to go back into the Navy again? Why did it make it so enticing to go into the Air Force, rank for rank, straight across and everything else? Couldn't get assigned overseas at this time period, but I ended up being stationed at Andrews. All the things, the roadblocks have been put in there. I got an assignment to Germany. One of the people in the ward, the branch there that we had, was single and that and so forth. And so I got in there about May or June, and she and her friend ended up leaving about January to come back to the States. So it was about 6 months or 7 months there that we got to know each other. That's how I first met my wife, future wife. So I corresponded then I was still over there for another 2.5 years, and she came back and she enrolled in University of Utah. So I came back. I was assigned to go to Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi for schooling. And I drove clear across the country to Salt Lake City and visited with her. She and I drove then to California where her parents were out visiting her brother, and then headed back to Biloxi, Mississippi, and put in about a year of schooling there. And it was while I was in Biloxi there that I wrote her a letter and asked her if she'd marry me, and never heard another word. So then I sent another letter and I says, I guess the proposal was so much that shocked you that you became speechless. And she wrote back, she says, well, didn't you get the telegram? I says, no. She says, well, I sent you a telegram. So I went down to the orderly room and asked him, and I said, oh yeah, there's one here. They had received a telegram and stuck it in a box and never notified me, in which she accepted the proposal. So when I got done, I ended up going up to Duluth, Minnesota, all the way up into the Canadian border. So then I went up there and we set up the date, 11 June. So then I reported in up there and took leave and went out to Salt Lake City. We got married in the Salt Lake Temple. But at the same time, she graduated from the University of Utah. And so attended her graduation and got married and reported into Duluth, Minnesota.
How long was that visit?
Well, it was about a week or two. That's that leading up to that point. She said later, she says this, it was sort of an overcast and dreary day when we pulled into Duluth, right on Lake Superior. The base I was assigned at is an early warning system, radars up along the northern Canada line and so forth. We were there, and of course it snows at night, gets cold up there. When we pulled in, it was dreary, so I went in to see about housing the older portion of the town, old houses and that. And she said later, she says, I saw that and I thought to myself, she says, what did I get myself into? But then we were there for about 11 months. Got to know everybody there and that, and she says she thoroughly enjoyed it. And then in 11 months, I got orders to go to Vietnam. So we packed up, took her back home to Salt Lake City to be with her parents, and I headed to Vietnam for a year. That was that. At the time, we knew that, she knew, and of course, because she had had problems when she was a teenager, so she couldn't have any children. Well, I knew that before I married her anyway. We had not been in Duluth that long, so we couldn't apply for an adoption there. Then got assigned up to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and some friends were telling us they had just adopted a child up there. And so we contacted the Nebraska Children's Home Society. Want to know what we were interested in? We were interested in a baby, and we said, sure. They said, how about siblings? And I'd been raised as a single child. I really wasn't familiar with the term siblings. So they mentioned, would you be interested in siblings? And I said, oh, sure. And I think my wife, she ended up going, huh? Anyway, they did a study on us and so forth, and they said, we'll let you know. One day while at work, I got a phone call from them, and they said, would you be interested in 3 children, a boy and his 2 sisters? I said, well, they said, if you are, you need to contact us and come on in for a visit with us. I said, okay, and I said, well, let me get a hold of my wife. So she came to pick me up after work. And I said, well, I got a phone call from the Nebraska Children's Home Society. She says, oh, they turned us down, huh? I said, no, they want to know if we would be interested in 3 children. So we went up there and got interviewed, and they placed the children with us. But I end up then getting orders to the Philippines. But then they placed the children with us, and so then I contacted them, and the Air Force then canceled the orders to the Philippines. When we got married, I was 30 years old, and my wife was about 33. This was a couple years later, so we ended up then with 3 children.